Thanks
Just
to the
jamming
music,
out.
Harry. Yeah, exactly. Well, hello, Barnes and Noble Book Club. It is really, really great to see everyone. And we have the coolest. I say this every month. I know I say this every month, but we have the coolest event in the world for you today. Jeannette Walls, as you know, is the author of Hang the Moon, which is our April BNN Book Club pick. But before we get to the fun stuff, there is, of course, as you know, if you've joined us before, housekeeping. So a couple of things. If you want to use the Q&A module to ask a question, feel free, drop it in there. I'm also watching the chat. I will grab your questions as we go. If you dropped a question into Eventbrite when you registered for the event, I have those questions. You may also know I don't like to hold questions until the end. We tend to work them in as we go. So drop them in. I promise I'll pay attention. There's lots of stuff happening, but I can do multiple things at once. So I'm super excited to be here, of course, with my partner in all things books, Shannon DeVito, and of course, Jeannette Walls. But before we really get going, reminder, there are spoilers in this conversation. We were very, very polite when we did the event at Union Square in New York, which we then put out over the wires as the Port Over podcast episode that featured Jeannette. But here, there will be spoilers, and there will be lots of them because I held back. I held back so much when we were doing that event. So Shannon, I know why we chose Hang the Moon for book club, but why don't you let our audience know why we did?
I loved this book, not only because when I realized that it was a parallel to Tudor history, which I also love, but Sally herself was such an indomitable, fierce kind of heroine. She's feisty. She just doesn't give up. The thread of her journey, I was like, it's just ripe for book club discussion. Not to mention, as Miwa said, we will be talking character death because my goodness, yes. there are quite a few that need to be talked about. So it's a wonderful novel in the body of work, and I thought it was completely ripe for discussion. So I'm excited to have this talk today.
And Jeannette, I know I've said this to you before, but I'm going to say it again. This novel does not feel like it took 17 drafts to get to the book that we got to read. So can we talk about that for a second? Because I mean, clearly, and I promise audience, we are getting to the Tudors part. We are getting to so much of what you guys want to talk about as well. But we kind of have to start with the 17 drafts thing.
I first of all, bless your heart for saying that, because it shouldn't read like it's just, a great writer once said, if it seems more than a moment's thought, all your stitching and unstitching are for naught. It should feel kind of spontaneous, but I researched this thing to death, and I worked really hard to try to make it feel old-fashioned without dated. Yeah. To get the lingo right without it feeling quaint, and to capture the mood. I mean, I love those images that you showed beforehand. Yep. And the time was so tumultuous and revolutionary, especially for women and what women were going through. And, we look at it now as quaint and old fashioned, but to go through those things, it was a scary time for a lot of people. And I think that prohibition was a reaction against those changes. I think that people are saying, God, the world is just going too fast. All of a sudden, all these people have rights that didn't used to. Let's try to control things and take away some people's rights. Right. And the prohibitionists were actually, they truly believed that if they outlawed liquor, that the saloons would close, the dads would go home and take care of their families, and lawlessness would be a thing of the past. Right. And of course, law of unintended consequences, the opposite happened. But I worked so hard to imagine what it would feel like to live through these times, not to experience them with the wisdom of hindsight, but to know, what was it like to be a woman 100 years ago?
And this is one of the first books that doesn't directly come out of your family's story. I mean, you know how much I love your grandmother. Well, I adore your grandmother.
Yeah, tough girl.
So, that's a whole nother book. But anyway, but let's talk about how we got here, because we've got a lot of questions about, wait a minute, were these folks based on real people? And yeah, there's a connection to the Tudors, but it's not one for one.
Yeah. Well, it's so interesting because I'd never thought I would write fiction. And two of my books were labeled fiction, but they were based on people I knew, experiences that I had. And I have to say, first of all, readers are smarter than I am. And that's one of the reasons that I love talking with readers. And I'd gone around to events actually telling people, I'm a truth teller, I'm a fact finder, I have no imagination. And it was a reader who said, ma'am, forgive me, I think you have a fabulous imagination, but you're afraid of your own creativity. And this reader had nailed something on the head. Both of my parents are wildly creative, but I think I associate creativity with lying and insanity, both of which run in my family. And so I decided to go ahead and try to unleash this beast of creativity. But in doing so, I relied on my old buddy, fact and research. And so, yeah, not just the Tudors, but everything in Prohibition, the characters and the events are largely inspired by actual events and historical characters. The challenge, and one of the reasons that we had 17 drafts, was making it my own, was bringing these characters to life and making them believable and feel like people that you could meet.
Did you know you wanted to set it in Prohibition kind of off the bat, or did that come naturally through the research and anchoring it into, as you say, kind of the fact, so to unleash your creativity?
You know, I've been fascinated by Prohibition for a long time. When I was a little girl, like many people watching out there right now, I would read anything with words on it. And one day when I was around 7 or 8 years old, that something was a whiskey bottle. And my mother had repurposed it into a vase, and I turned it around and it said, "Federal law forbids sale or reuse of this bottle." And I said, "We gotta dump out the flowers. We're breaking the law." And she said, "What are you talking about?" And I showed her. She said, "Oh, that's a stupid law. You can ignore that." I went, "What are you talking about, Mom? We're breaking laws all the time, but this one's easy to fix." And she explained to me about Prohibition. And I wanted to live during this magical time because Dad was a raging alcoholic. And I, like the prohibitionists, believed that this would have solved all my problems. So I'd long been fascinated by that period, not just because of Prohibition, but because of those changes I was talking about. That period where most of America was starting to get automobiles and electricity. And as somebody who grew up without electricity, I know how magical and transformative that is. And I wanted to visit this time. So it's a coming of age book about Sally Kincaid, the main character, while America is going through its own coming of age crisis.
You know, before we get too deep into things, we've had a couple of people ask about the title. There's some folks who know that it comes from a larger reference, and then there's some other folks who are just like, well, how did we get here? So because I think it's a really fun story behind it. Hang the Moon. How'd you pick it?
Yeah, you know, I think it might be a largely Southern phrase.
Yep.
I hear it here kind of a lot, like, well, she thinks that her daddy hung the moon and scattered the stars. So it means idealizing somebody. And so I just wanted to take this idea of this young woman, Sally Kincaid, who thinks that her daddy hung the moon. And part of the whole coming of age journey for her is the realization that her father, like most human beings, is a flawed individual, and coming to terms with that and trying to figure out, well, who does hang the moon? Who deserves the credit for all of these wondrous gifts that I had credited my father with? And there's a bunch of puns as well.
Did you? Yeah, this idea of moonshine too, with the phrase. Did that play into it as well, or did it really kind of stem from the reverence?
Absolutely.
Of the Duke?
You know, yeah, there's the whole moonshine thing, and then there's her moonstone necklace as well. So there's a motif, as we writers say.
Yeah, but there's also just a lot of fun. And I want to talk about the voice for a second, because voice is the first thing I read for, straight up. That is the thing that I want. And Sally just sits with me even now, right? It's been a while since I finished reading this book for the first time. And it's just, I miss her. I really do. She is so ferocious and wonderful, and just really like, who are you to define whether or not I'm a respectable person? And I love it. She was so ahead of her time in so many ways. And she showed up first for you, right? I mean, I know you were talking about the idea of Virginia and wanting to have this coming of age story against the backdrop of America, but really you started with Sally, right?
Well, Miwa, you're so dang smart, but that's not a shock. But yeah, voice. That, to me, that is what makes or breaks a book.
Right.
And I did not have the voice of this book for a while.
Okay.
And it wasn't until it had been third person past, and it wasn't until I put it in first person present that, oh my gosh, here's Sally. And all of a sudden she
Right.
came alive for me. And I wouldn't have thought it would make that much difference, but I kept on talking about those people in a kind of
Right.
remote way and what she is doing. And as soon
Mhm.
as I switched it over to first person present, oh my gosh, here's Sally.
Yeah.
And so far as, it's true that in some ways Sally was ahead of her times, but in another way, those tough mountain gals,
Mhm.
they did a lot of that work and just didn't get the credit for it. In fact, I think sometimes they were ashamed by it because they wanted to be society ladies and put on the white gloves. But they were the ones who rolled up their sleeves and did the
Mhm.
plowing and did the milking and all that hard work.
Mhm.
So yeah, finding Sally's voice is really when the book started
Mhm.
clicking for me. And sometimes when it wasn't working, when the dialogue wasn't working, my husband and I would actually act out.
I love this part. I love this part of the story. I mean, it's nice to have someone at home that you can work through this stuff with.
Oh yeah, absolutely. The dialogue would feel flat, and it would feel like Sally wouldn't say this. And so my husband would say, okay, I'll play the Duke and you play Sally. Now I'm just gonna say the Duke's lines and you just say what comes out. And don't think about it, just say it. And I have to say that part of my journey coming to fiction, the wonderful Lisa DeGenoa, who wrote Still Alice and many other books, she once said the greatest advice she ever got in writing fiction was to take an acting class. And I still haven't taken an acting class, but having spent time on the movie set of The Glass Castle, watching those actors become these people that they'd never spent time with, that they just investigated and thought about. I think that just greatly helped me in creating these characters who lived 100 years ago and trying to get inside their heads. So especially Sally, getting inside the head of this woman who is in denial about so many things and to try to empathize. And one of the challenges was, this is somebody who doesn't think a whole lot about what she does.
Right.
She's never been to therapy. So how do you talk about her conflict and these emotions she's going through when this is somebody who doesn't examine her own emotions?
And shame is a big part of this world, right? Shame is a tool that people use to keep other people in line, right? And yet it's not a word any of them would whip out at any given, like, I'm not even sure any of them even really know what the word means or that it even exists. And but it's a tool for the community. It really is.
And this whole sense of what you should be, I think the word need now a lot more. You need to go, need to, but back then it was always you should or you must. And that was a little word I twigged onto it. Just, I think that people say you need to fill in the blank, but back then it was always you should or must. There was a moral imperative.
Yeah.
It was just overwhelming to all actions.
So, another question for you though, when it comes to having found Sally's voice by going into the first person present and then you find it, was that the biggest surprise for you when you were writing this book?
Oh, there were so many surprises along the way. And, every now and then, this doesn't feel like what Sally would do. What would you do? Like, oh, that's what you do. So it kind of some people say that they hate it when authors say that the book takes on a life of their own, but it kind of does. It kind of does. And there's these things that, well, this just doesn't feel satisfying. It doesn't feel deep enough. And things happen like, oh, that's what Sally does. So yeah, there were a lot of surprises for me along the way.
What were some of the other surprises?
Well, her whole grappling with romance, her whole how she wants to be taken care of. She wants a man in her life, but she doesn't. So how does she deal with that?
Right.
How does she, and even her level of getting into the moonshining on the level that she does. As I said, I researched everything in advance to make sure that it was all credible. And in my research, I found this woman from Virginia during Prohibition, and she was the fastest, most fearless moonshine runner in Franklin County, which was the big moonshining county in Virginia. And she was the only woman who would drive with an open throttle down a certain dangerous mountain. So Sally took on that role. And, I hope that readers don't find that over the top. But again, I wouldn't have put anything in this book that couldn't have happened in this period. And it did surprise me the degree to which women would just, there were a lot of moonshiners, they didn't talk about it. They didn't,
Right.
unfortunately for my research, they didn't keep diaries either. So, I had to refer to court transcripts and things like that to try to figure out what was going on.
Right. Shannon, what was the biggest surprise for you, or surprises plural?
It was interesting how much empathy I think I had for the characters of Mary and Georgette and these other women that found themselves in circumstances that they used something different than Sally did to survive, or in Mary's case, not survive. But the empathy that I had for them, they did feel so much more real. And it is, I've studied different pieces of history, but they just felt very fierce in their own way. And then the murder of, spoiler alert, the murder of Georgette from her husband, and the kind of grudging respect that Sally actually had for her at some point, even though she hated her, especially with the necklace, that, she used different skills to try and make it in the world. And Sally, I think for me, was really modeling a lot of her behavior after the Duke, which is why it made romance so hard. It's not like he figured it out. So she didn't really have a blueprint to say, this is how I approach a healthy romantic relationship. But man,
can I interrupt?
I got alcohol.
Can I just say something? I love you. You're going to make me start crying. I love it when a reader understands the book that deeply, because oh my gosh, I'm having a flash here. Thank you. Because that is so much what it's about these women who had to survive, and what tools do they use during this time when the tool chest was kind of limited to them.
Yeah.
And, so they all had to resort to different things. So thank you. That's a really beautiful insight into the book and the structure. Thank you.
Yeah, well, you wrote it, so I loved it.
Okay, but now I'm going to throw a wrench into it, because all of my notes were, I can't wait for Mary to die. She needs to die fast.
I knew you'd be like that. Like,
I was just waiting for her to die. I get I 100% what Shannon said too. Don't misunderstand me, but I just had a very, very visceral reaction to Mary and her sanctimony. I don't do well with sanctimony. I really don't do well with that. And I was just like, hurry up and die, lady.
But that's good. You can love somebody and hate them at the same time.
Right.
I mean, as long as it's like, to me, that those conflicting emotions are what makes a story interesting. Right. I'm just not interested in people who are all good or all bad. And, the hero in the white hat and the villain with the black mustache. It's much more like, wow, she's just really damaged this Mary woman. And she's got these blinders on.
Yep.
And just, she refuses to see things from other people's perspective.
Mm-hmm.
And we've got a couple of questions too about how you actually keep track of all of this complex plot lines and their resolution and everything else. You're not an outliner though, if I remember correctly, right?
No, I'm not. I'm a sloppy thinker, but it's kind of like you become so immersed in this world.
Right.
That it's almost like having, and I hate to admit the level at which I just got kind of overtaken by the Kincaid family and all of their Michigas, but it was, these people became very real to me. Right. So it's not like, including like when I did the audiobook, it was sort of like, I knew what they all sounded like. I knew their problems. I knew what was going on because that's the world that you become immersed in, and their problems. So I did have the problem. I had to cut out some subplots because the whole thing just got too crazy. Right. Yeah, that's, again, one of the reasons for the 17 drafts.
Yeah, can we come back to the Tudors for a second? Because Jenny Houghton and Joanne Mahoney sort of have sort of a variation on the question, and it all comes back to the Tudors, because Joanne is asking if Sally's character is patterned after anyone real, which sort of is, sort of isn't. And then Jeannie's just asking very sort of specifically how you took inspiration from Tudor England / Henry VIII and how you translated Elizabeth I into Sally Kincaid. So can we go back to that for a second?
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, many of the characters are based on both prohibition and Tudor characters. So it was a kind of mushing together of them. But I'd long been fascinated by the Tudors because my crazy parents, they would have these screaming fights about Elizabeth I. My dad adored her and my mom hated her. My mom said, she was just like my mother. She was bossy. She always had to have things her way. And dad just admired her because she was a tough ass broad who like wouldn't let people tell her how to lead her life. And she defied all the odds. And I'd long been fascinated by this woman who everybody underestimated. Everybody said, you know, because of the circumstances of her birth and the scandal of her mother, she would amount to nothing. And I think it was not in spite of all the problems that she went through, but because of that. That being said, Sally is not Elizabeth I.
Right.
She's a very, very different person. I mean, Elizabeth I, bless her heart, she could be arrogant. And it's one thing to be arrogant about being the Queen of England. It's another thing to be arrogant about the head of a moonshine operation. So I had to make Sally my own. I had to make her, you know, and I didn't know Elizabeth enough to truly get inside her head. There's not a lot of material about her, though a number of actors have done a fabulous job, but it just wouldn't have made sense to take that personality and put her in rural Virginia. But it was that template that I found so fascinating about not just making it in a man's world, a woman making it in a man's world, but resisting all this pressure to let a man take over, not just because she knew she would lose power, but because of these things that had happened to her and her suspicion about man and marriage and the whole process of giving up your power and what happens then to a woman. I thought it was a fascinating, not necessarily modern template, but timeless one.
Yeah, and I think that timelessness is important. And I want to go to language for a second, because one of the things I really appreciate about Hang the Moon, and I know I'm not the only person, but the idea that we're never stuck in this ye olde timey languagey kind of thing. Like language can be distracting. And I don't like to be taken out of the story. And I just wanted to be with Sally and the Duke and some other folks who were driving me up a tree, but for the right reasons. Everyone understands what I'm saying. But
I love you.
I don't want to be taken out because someone's saying, let's go do the Lindy Hop, you know?
Thank you so much for that. Thank you so much. That was a bit of a struggle for me because I didn't want it to be the Lindy Hop or, you know.
Right. I even have the era wrong. I know that's a 40s reference, but you understand what I'm saying.
Gee Willikers, or let's go Charleston or let's go to the local, you know, Blind Tiger and tie one on. No, it absolutely. And it was a real struggle for me because I wanted to feel old fashioned without, as you so lovely, eloquently said, taking you out of the moment. So it's a real balancing act. So I had to make sure that the words weren't contemporary. And I was shocked by how many words I couldn't use. I couldn't use gussied up. That was a 1930s word.
Wow.
Ritzy, you know, there's so much of our, because I wanted it to be somewhat colloquial.
Yeah.
Without feeling dated. And originally she was a bit of a potty mouth, and I'm going to say a little bit of a curse word here.
That's
so
fine.
Anybody who's really easily offended, mute for a second. But her go-to curse word was dumbass. And that's kind of my go-to curse word. She was always talking about all the time, talking about these dumbass prohibition laws. And then I found out through this wonderful resource, Green's Dictionary of Slang, that's a mid-century curse word. It was a curse word where a lot of our curse words come from. So I had to lose all my dumbasses, and it broke my heart. But the truth is, it felt more accurate because she started sounding like a mid-century gun mold type of a thing. So I worked very, very hard to make the language simple, accessible, old-fashioned without feeling archaic or quaint.
Right. I think that's huge. I think that's totally huge. Shannon, what was your favorite moment in Hang the Moon? Can you narrow it down to one, or can we get a couple from you?
I don't know if I can narrow it down.
Yeah,
I did feel a sense of hope at the ending in general, and I was pleasantly surprised by that because I wasn't sure if I could feel like she was this fully rounded character. Honestly, the most dramatic scene that I loved, because I loved the effect it had on every character, was actually the Duke's death. How that just the ripple into the entire town, and you could see the characters react kind of immediately and kind of, you know, was it an accident? Wasn't it? And that piece of it I loved so much so that our edition, of course, has the bridge, which we still have copies in store, by the way. But I that one, that really stuck with me because it was so, he was in the prime of his life. It was very, he was larger than life, and no one hypothetically was really expecting that. So that effect, I think that was probably my favorite part if I had to narrow it down.
I'm actually glad Maddie got a happy ending.
Oh,
I'm glad Maddie got, because I was a little worried that Maddie was just going to be stuck.
yeah.
And if she had, it would have been true to the story. I mean, certainly it would have been organic to the story and everything else. But I was kind of pleased that Maddie got a thing at the end. I'm just like, this is just nice. And now Maddie's going to be less difficult because she has a thing. Like everyone needs a thing, right?
Everyone needs a thing, especially the Maddies of this
Oh,
world.
yes. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, my grandmother was a lot like a Maddie. This
Yep.
woman could have accomplished anything. And I was kind of thinking of her with the Maddie character. And you put him in a position of power and everybody kind of wins,
Yeah, right.
Yeah, so thank you for that. And meanwhile, originally I gotta say that Maddie was more of a minor character, and I pulled her to the front a little bit more.
Oh, I'm glad you did, actually. I mean, because
Mm-hmm.
and maybe this is because I have a lot of prickly New England ladies in my background, but yeah, she was very familiar. I mean, she's a certain kind of gal, and I'm just like, yes, I know who you are. I want to go back to language for a second though, because we have two questions about the audiobook, one from Anne Burlingame and one from Audrey Murawski. I hope I said that right, Audrey. I'm sorry if I didn't. Both love the sound of your voice. Both are very excited by the fact that you read the audiobook, and both would like to know why you chose to do that. I mean, why not? But it's a fun question to ask.
I love doing the audio. It's so hard. It's so hard, but so much fun. And I'll tell you, I was really nervous about this one because I didn't know the people. I've done the audio for all of my books, and I was really nervous. And so I practiced the prologue about 4 or 5 times in advance. And the wonderful producer on it, she said, that was good, but in the second page, 3rd paragraph, I didn't hear intentionality. What do I look like, Meryl Streep here? I mean, intentionality, I'm not an actor. And she said, you did the voices, I'm going to treat you like an actor. And she pushed me harder than and pulled more of a performance out of me than I thought I could do. So it's one of those many lessons in life, like just throw yourself into it,
How long did that take to record an audiobook? I'm just curious.
It took 5 days. It was supposed to take 5 full days. Yeah. It took 5 full days, 4.5, because I had such a blast. They only like to do 6 hours because you're supposed to run out of energy, but I can only record it. I had such a good time with it. But I will confess that by the end, I couldn't say anything. I felt like this. But one of the reasons it's so hard is the microphone is so sensitive. It picks up your stomach noises and these little click noises that your mouth makes that you don't hear. So you have to keep on doing retakes. But the producers were just wonderful and kept on working with me, and it was a blast.
Can we talk about Virginia for a second? Because Virginia is a character, and we're not talking DC suburbs, Virginia. We're talking Virginia. And you've said, because you live kind of out in the sticks, my friend. And you've said, though, you've stolen quite a lot from where you live. And I want to bring people into that part of the conversation, because I love it when the landscape is part of the world to the extent that it's its own character, which is exactly what happens here.
Yeah, I think a lot of us have an internal landscape. Like we love the beach, or we love the city, or whatever. And for me, it's the rolling green hills. I always feel at home when I see these soft mountains. But Virginia is so interesting. It's because it has this rich history, but it's filled with contradictions. It's kind of the best and the worst of America. I mean, so many of our founding fathers come from Virginia. So many of the presidents come from here, and Jefferson lived not far away from where I live now. And so here's this man who said all men are created equal, and he had enslaved children. So you how do you reconcile the tension of this place and these people? I love contradictions. I love trying to examine, how do people make peace with their decisions? How do they pack away these things that they know they shouldn't do? They put it in the corner of their mind and move on. So I love the landscape for Virginia. I love the history, and I love the people for all their contradictions, the light and the dark.
Yeah, I mean, well, if you don't have light and dark, you don't get a story.
Yeah.
I mean, stuff has to happen. Stuff
Exactly.
really has to
Yeah.
happen.
And so I've stolen shamelessly from
Mhm.
the place and the people that I live with, they're the lovely, figures of speech. And I made the decision not to write in dialect because since it's first person present, she doesn't sound funny to herself, but I've made a
Right.
couple of points of when she goes outside of her little hometown that people realize that she talks funny. And you have to remember that it's 1919, 1920. This is before radio.
Yeah.
So people didn't have a reference point for how most people sound.
Yeah, and also too, like if you're watching a movie from like the 30s, Claudette Colbert comes to mind. Like the first time I saw one of her movies and I was like, wow, that voice.
Yeah.
Wow, that's squeaky. That is not, and I'm sort of shaking my head because it never connected with the photographs I'd seen. I was just like, wait a minute,
No,
like now I understand the evolution of Betty Boop, but like I don't like how
Because
did
it
we get
looks so
Yeah,
much austere and serious, and it's black and white,
and then
you're
all
like,
of a
oh,
sudden
that's
it's like squeak, squeak, squeak. It's just like, what is happening here?
No, it's true because people spoke differently then.
Yeah.
And even some of this they had this way of speaking in the
Yeah.
movie, this the voice that the guys had, this sort of senatorial, and so that is one of the challenges is you want to make it sound like they sound, but not. You want to make it accessible and real, but you can't. It's jarring. You don't want to take them out of the moment. You don't want to take the readers out of the moment. Like, who are those people? Because I think that one of the challenges of fiction writing is to bring people into this world.
Absolutely.
And make them feel comfortable in that world.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I mean, I have no physical connection to the events in this story, but there are people that I recognize, certainly throughout it. And, whether that's, characters I've met in other books or what have you, but it's just, I felt very, I mean, I was in it. I was in this book, and I know Shannon was too, right? I mean, you were completely from like the first page, you were in it.
absolutely drawn in. Yeah. And it's funny how we look at historical fiction. I know this historical fiction is technically that anything that takes place over 20 years ago, which is just wild to me.
Yeah, that number is not long enough.
Yeah, it's just
that
not
number
long
needs
enough.
to be larger. I'm sorry.
It does speak to how quickly things can change. And I think to your point earlier, Jeannette, when you were talking about, the prohibition in the 20s and the advent of the radio and automobiles, life was suddenly moving at such a quickened pace compared to where it had been, and kind of all of the things that were happening all at once was just drastically affecting how everyone was reacting to each other. And it was much more saturated with emotion because you could control as much of what was around you.
There was that, but also you knew your people. I mean, exile was a big deal. Like if you got kicked out of your community, I have to say, like, I get why Duke sent Sally away and he's trying to appease his wife and he's got his son and everything else. And I know we need, an inciting incident to start the story, but I was like, dude, you're sending away your tiny little girl because you're choosing your wife over your, okay. But exile, like she is sent to a really rough place, even though it's family, like, and I'm going, I get that this has to happen, but I'm having a moment where I am mad for Sally. Like, seriously, dude, what are you doing? And, luckily everything turns out the way it's supposed to. But I did have a moment of, oh man, here we go. Like, he's thinking about his legacy. He's thinking about his boy child. He's thinking about the fact that what people see in that house with him and Jane and the little boy. And it's like, well, that's what we're presenting. And, exile is still a really exile and shame, man. I mean, we get it going back and back and back into the records and the idea that
and like you said, community, especially then, it was so tight and you were so defined by these little clans because people didn't get far outside of their community. In fact, there was a line in my research that I stole from one of these ads from the 19-teens, and it said 10 miles used to be a long way. And it was being outside. It was an all-day trip to hitch up the wagon and go into town and forget people coming from other counties into your town. But then around the 20s, it really started happening. And it was a kind of scary world.
Yeah, totally. We have a couple of questions from the Q&A that I want to get to because they're very specific story questions. And I wanted us to get a little further in the conversation before I jumped here. So Jane Ellen Johnson is wondering, why did Faye's daughter not become the heir upon Sally learning her sister's identity?
Because I'm sorry, why did
So Faye's daughter, I think basically it's a succession
why did
question.
Nell
Yeah.
why did Nell not
become the
heir?
person when we find out that she's the Duke's
Because
daughter?
she wasn't
basically.
legitimate.
Yeah. Okay. That's what I thought.
Yeah.
And then Annie is wondering what happened to Sally afterwards. Was she able to escape the family's path and truly build something past and truly build something new / her own?
Gosh, I mean, I haven't. Well, we know Sally is, yes, basically, yes. Yes, Sally will make something her own. There's just no question. Specifically, what that is and how that will look, I don't know. Because Sally kept surprising me with what she did and what she didn't do.
Right.
And I have some idea of the direction she would go, but I don't know the specifics.
That's fair. Linda George is asking you to talk a little bit about the house and the 2 additions and the connection to the 3 generations. We should talk about the real estate. This is a very big part of the book.
Oh, again, this is an inspiration from real life. I take notes all the time, but there's a couple of houses like that around here. In fact, one that my husband and I were looking to buy, and it was just so fascinating to me when we visited it that you could just see the history of it. Like, here's the old one, here's where they got prosperous, and here's where they got really prosperous. And it was just, this multi-generational thing. And I mean, I love real estate. I love looking, especially old houses. You can figure out the history of them. And in this one, the history was just, it was blatant. It was just laid out there for everyone to see.
So we also,
just real quick on the big house, because I'm curious when you're mapping things out, did you draw a layout of what the house would look like and how they'd interact? And
There was a layout of the house, there was a layout of the town. So yeah, absolutely. I'm not good with spatial stuff, so I had to sort of, that I can't keep in my head. I can keep the characters in my head, but okay, so they turned here and there, but yeah.
So, talking about structure and housing and all of that kind of stuff, I want to go to a different kind of structure question because we have a couple of questions about craft. And let's see. Amy London is asking, what's your greatest challenge when you start a novel? Is it finding, is it voice? Is that the thing where
you're Amy, it is exactly. And it is exactly voice. It is voice. It is once you get that, then you're okay. I also feel that character is more plot. It's character plot to me. That's kind of the order. And if you get the voice and the character, I think the plot doesn't matter as much, though people have either complimented me or accused me of having a very plotty book here. That this is definitely a book with a lot of events and a lot of twists and turns, but it's the voice. It's getting inside somebody's head. That's the big challenge.
Plot focus is cinematic for me. That's how I like to think about it, because it's the images, the action just keeps moving, which is, I love that about books. So
it's like unscrolling a movie in your head.
Yeah.
I mean, and you do the casting and you do, it's literally, and maybe you edit again. I don't know. Everyone reads differently. Ann Kushner is wondering, after creating a rich, full character, do the characters you create or characteristics you create for that person affect or change you?
Oh, what an interesting question, Anne. Yes, I believe they do. I believe they do. And I think that is one of the reasons that we like to read, not just write, but read as well. I think that fiction writing is an act of empathy, and it's an act of getting inside people's heads. And if you successfully do it, then you think about not just the main character, but your other characters as well. And I think that's also one of the reasons we read, that when a writer has done that successfully, we feel that we get to know people. And as in real life, when you know people and they profoundly affect you, they change you somewhat. But what a lovely, interesting question. Thank you.
So, and I'm going to riff off of something that Kristen C. has asked. Your childhood, I mean, we all have read The Glass Castle. You've been very open about it. Many of us have seen the movie as well. But that empathy and that story, is that is that experience what made it possible for you to write fiction? I mean, I love the story about your parents fighting over Queen Elizabeth I. I'm sorry. That is the funniest freaking thing. I just, the
The
idea
best
of
thing to argue
it's
about.
like, yeah, I'm just like, okay. I mean, everyone has their thing, but I mean, yes, I mean, we've, like I've said, we've all read the Glass Castle, but isn't that how we got here? Isn't that what made it possible for you to write the fiction that you write?
Well, certainly the Glass Castle, writing it changed my life. I don't know if in my childhood, I don't know if that's what gave me empathy or whatever. The
Right.
big change in my life, and I think the thing that has given me the great empathy,
Mhm.
whatever empathy I have, I don't want to say I have great empathy, but
Right.
it has been readers' reactions to my story.
Yeah.
People have asked me, how could I possibly forgive my parents? The person I had to forgive was myself.
Mhm.
And I've done that through readers' reactions to my
Right.
story. I was completely prepared to be met with contempt and ridicule. I was unprepared to be met with compassion and understanding. People ask me, well, have you been in therapy? No, I just hang out with book clubs. They get me. And people coming up and telling me their stories. And I think that again is why we read and write, why we tell stories and why we read stories, is it takes us out of our isolation and makes us feel
Completely.
like we're not alone.
Yeah, no, I do genuinely believe, and I've said this many, many times, and I'm never going to stop saying it, but I do believe that we can change the world with story. Like, we just have to keep telling stories. And you'll find that one that you think, hey, I have nothing in common with this person. And then they just zing, the lightning bolt hits, and you're like,
Yeah,
oh,
meanwhile,
wait.
words can create hatred and
Mhm.
dissonance, but they can also create great empathy. And this woman, she said, Jeannette, I'm going to be honest with you. When I saw that you'd written about some, moonshiner from the 19, this is an African American woman I met
Right.
in Washington D.C. She said, I had no interest in reading this book.
Right.
Okay, what do I have in common with this woman? And then I read it and I thought, how does she know my mother? She said, Sally Kincaid was my mother. So, it's making these connections with people who might have a different color. They might have lived during a different time, but it's making these connections. I believe that's why we read and write.
Yeah, without a doubt, without a doubt. Cynthia Harris, though, is wondering if the Duke might have a little bit of your dad in him.
He is very interesting question, but not really.
Yeah,
To me,
that's what
he's not the opposite of my dad, but I really wanted to explore the dark side of having a dad who everybody else thinks is perfect.
right.
And my dad was and everybody knew he was just like a no good. But Sally grew up with this weird contradiction, and I know so many people like this. Their dad is the powerful, perfect, whatever, and that has a downside too.
Right.
And coming to terms with that, I think, can be more complicated than coming to terms with the dad who's the town drunk, because that's more, that's clear that everybody knows that he's flawed. But if you had this dad who's adored, and you just gently have to peel away, or not so gently, peel away the facade and realize, oh my gosh, he's not who everybody thought he is.
Yeah, that's a really, really rough realization to have, when you're just like, oh, my parents are human.
Yeah.
Oh, my parents are super, like,
Yeah.
we all think our parents sort of show up on the planet at whatever age they were when you sort of became aware of them as parents, right?
From the head of Zeus.
Yeah. And I
You're like,
and I look
sure.
back at my parents and I'm like, oh, right, you were people before you had children. You were people, right? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, you had your own baggage and your own damage done to you. And I've heard it said that we become adults not when we vote or come of drinking age. It's when we realize that our parents are human too.
Yeah. And it's really liberating, actually, to be able to say, especially if you have complicated parents, it's really liberating to be able to say, oh, I have a thing now. I have a thing, and it's separate from that thing. Like, yeah, I am who I am, and all of my experiences have made me who I am. But at the same time, you can be like, and now I'm moving forward. It feels like you get to like throw a thing into the water and be like, yeah, I'm good. Thanks. I'm moving forward. But speaking of pasts, who are some of the writers who've influenced you, Jeannette?
When I was about 10 years old, maybe a little bit younger, a librarian put A Tree Grows in Brooklyn into my hands. And it was such an eye-opener for me, because little Francie Nolan, she wasn't too pretty. She certainly wasn't popular. She had a drunken daddy who she adored. and she loved books.
Mhm.
And that's what got her through. And I didn't have a whole lot of friends when I was a kid, but I had Francie Nolan. So that was, and then the same year I read Grapes of Wrath. And it also profoundly affected me because here was a family that would not have looked down on the Walls family.
Yeah. No, I
And
get it.
so it's funny because I believed so much in truth telling and nonfiction, but those two books are ostensibly fiction,
Right.
but they were so deeply rooted in research. I mean, The Tree Grows in Brooklyn was probably pretty much a memoir. It was called fiction. But I mean, that's one of the reasons that I think I wanted to cross over into fiction writing, is because that can be powerful as well. We can tell the truth with these fictional stories. But I believe that we mine the veins of reality to make it realistic and credible and authentic.
I think sometimes emotional truth can hit harder than factual truth. I think factual truth, it's kind of easy to put up a hand and be like, wait, no, what? And emotional truth, I think you carry around a little longer and a little harder. Julie Snyder is wondering if you would say more about how you created Eddie's character.
Oh, I love this.
Eddie.
Eddie started out a little bit different.
Okay.
He started out a little bit more two-dimensional. They all did, because they were all based on these somewhat historical characters, and I had to kind of breathe life into them. But I grew to love Eddie so much in his vulnerabilities. And originally he was just the spoiled. Originally he was too much from Sally's perspective. He was the kid who had everything, and she kind of resented that.
Right.
And then as I worked on it a little bit longer, I decided, it's not fair to Eddie either. He was given almost as raw a deal as Sally was, in that, Sally wasn't allowed to go into the business, but he's being forced into it. So I kind of wanted to inhabit that a little bit more and explore what that would feel like. This young man who he wanted to play the piano, he wanted to be himself. And that was the unfair thing about this time, about many times. I mean, it can be true now, that, people being forced into roles.
Right.
Like I said, Eddie kind of evolved from just being a bratty kid into something that was just a lot more vulnerable.
Do you miss these guys?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I don't really miss them because it's still in my head.
Still there.
They won't go away. I kind of wish they would, like, leave me alone, people, But yeah, after I finished the story, I thought, I never want to think about these idiots again. I never want to get away from me, these crazy Kincaids and these mountain people, just leave me alone. And they're just kind of staying there. But yeah, I do think about them a lot, about, what they're up to, and did I do them justice? Did I, should I have given this person another scene? Because a lot of scenes were cut, and what about this person's scene? But yeah, I and this makes me feel a little insane, but I grew to truly love each of these characters.
Yeah. I get that. I mean, because here's the thing, especially in a story like this, you don't want to go all black and white, like here's the good guy, here's the bad guy. I mean, Duke could have been a terror to plenty of people in the community. And yet, I was sad when he fell over and, bad things happened. But
yeah, there are people like him, especially, in this community where I live in Virginia, these kind of larger than life, benevolent, patriarchal, but at the same time self-serving people. And many people are drawn to people like that. I will take care of you, but don't question me.
Right.
And it can be an appealing people. They're inevitably charismatic. They love having an audience. They love having respect and power, and they know how to get both.
Okay, I knew this was going to happen. We're bumping up against time, but Maria Schwab sneaking in a question under the wire. Might there be a sequel?
Oh. Shut your mouth, girl. I don't know. I thought I was done with them, but I don't know. Sally wore me out. She wore me.
Fair.
But I don't know what will happen with so just stay tuned. What can I say?
We can be patient. We can be patient.
You can be very patient.
Shannon, what do you want the audience to know about Hang the Moon? I mean, we've said a lot of things today, but I think you've been summing it up pretty well in-house, and I'm hoping you'll just sort of riff on that here.
I think the biggest thing is no matter the time period, we never should judge people based on their actions alone, because there's always a story behind how they were raised, what they're reacting to, who they are as a person, and how they became that person. And I think this book, particularly with the amount of characters that really surround Sally, it makes it really clear all of the different angles that they're coming from, and how we can act or react, based on either a shared history or a history that needs to be learned. So just going back to this idea of personal connections, and you never know who you're going to relate to or what's going to just spark something different. That's what we want books to do. That's what we want book clubs to do. And that's how we want to connect with each other. So I think this book is a perfect example of doing that.
Yeah, and that seems like a really, really good place to wrap up. But Jeannette, you were going to say something, and then
I just want Shannon to go on book tour with me, because
we can send her. That's okay. You can her.
I'll pack books in my suitcase. I'll read the whole, it'll be brilliant.
But this is why we all hang out with book club people. I mean, Jeannette, you've learned everything from book club people. I love hanging out with book club people. I love you're a research nerd. I'm just a book nerd. I just want to talk about books all the time with other people. And this was so much fun, you women. It was so
Thank you for
spending
this.
the afternoon. Seriously, Jeannette, this book is a marvel and a wonder, and it is so groovy, and I'm so glad you wrote it, and I'm glad all of you joined us. But thank you. We will see you guys next month, and I think we dropped the name of the new book and also links to Jeanette's backlist, because you guys should, if you haven't read the other two novels, please do, because they're awesome. Jeannette, thank you again. It was so good to see you. Shannon, I'll see you upstairs in a minute. Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you
Bye.
so much. I had a blast.
Thank you.